On the day her father was buried, a girl of 18 was handed nothing. Not a dollar, not a deed. Not so much as a photograph from the house she grew up in. The estate lawyer had already seen to that. What he hadn't counted on was the cardboard shoebox her father had left in the back of a neighbor's closet, or the folded paper inside it, or what that paper said. What she found in that letter wasn't just a will. It was proof that everything she'd been told about her own life was a lie. If you've ever felt cheated out of something that was rightfully yours, if you've ever been told by someone in a position of power that you simply didn't matter, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. The day I buried my father was the day I learned what it meant to own nothing. I was 18 years old. I had no mother, no siblings, no relatives who'd return a phone call. What I had was a black duffel bag I'd packed in 20 minutes while Mr. Harlan Briggs, my father's estate lawyer, stood in the doorway of the house I had lived in my entire life and watched me with the expression of a man waiting for a bus. He was a tall man with silver hair brushed back from a high forehead and a suit that cost more than my father had earned in a month working the mill. He wore small gold cufflinks and a watch that caught the light when he moved his hand. I remember thinking, even in my grief, that he had the eyes of someone who had long ago decided that other people's pain was a matter of paperwork. His firm had handled my father's affairs for years, he told me. He had the death certificate, the property deed, the bank account numbers. He had everything, he said, well in hand. I was a minor child who had just turned 18. There was nothing for me to do but collect my things. He said it pleasantly. He said it like he was doing me a kindness. I packed the duffel in that 20 minutes. 2 pairs of jeans, a handful of shirts, a worn copy of a John Steinbeck novel my father had given me years ago with his handwriting in the margins, and a faded photograph of the 2 of us standing in front of the property out on Sutter Road. The one my grandfather had worked and my father had paid off board by board. I had been maybe 6 years old in the photograph. My father's hand was on my shoulder, and he was squinting into the sun, smiling. I put the photograph in the front pocket of the bag where I could reach it without looking. Outside, the sky was the color of old dishwater, and there was a fine cold drizzle coming down through the bare oaks. I stepped off the porch that my father had rebuilt with his own hands, and I did not look back. Mr. Briggs closed the door behind me. I heard the lock turn. I had no idea the manila envelope waiting for me across town was about to change everything. The envelope came from a neighbor 2 streets over, a woman named Dorothy who had known my father since before I was born. She handed it to me on her porch the morning after the funeral, her face composed and careful in the way people's faces get when they are holding something difficult. She told me my father had given it to her 6 months before he died, when he had gotten the first diagnosis. He told her to give it to me directly, and only to me after the estate had been settled. He had been specific about that. After, not before. I asked her why, and she looked at the envelope in my hands and then back at me and said, quietly, that she thought my father had known something she hadn't. I sat down on her front step in the drizzle and held the envelope in my lap for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a handwritten note on a piece of loose leaf paper, and beneath it, folded in thirds and worn soft along the crease lines, was another document. The note said, Maya, take this to a lawyer, not Briggs, a different lawyer. The document is real. What he told you isn't. I love you. That was all, 5 sentences. I read it 3 times. Then I unfolded the second document. It was a will. Handwritten, dated October 14th, 1979, in my grandfather's hand. My father had been 17 years old when his own father wrote it. It named the property on Sutter Road, all 212 acres, including the eastern timber rights and the mineral survey conducted by the county in 1961. And it bequeathed them, in plain and careful language, first to my father, and upon his death, directly to me. It had been witnessed by 2 signatures I didn't recognize, and notarized by a man in town whose office was still open on the main street. And at the bottom, in a different ink but in the same hand, my grandfather had added a single line sometime after the original date. "Do not let them take what belongs to her." I sat with that document in my lap for a very long time. The drizzle turned to rain. Dorothy brought me a cup of coffee that I didn't drink. I kept reading the line at the bottom. "Do not let them take what belongs to her." I was shaking before I understood why. I found Mr. Alistair Thorne through a listing pinned to a corkboard in the back of the county library. His office was on the 2nd floor of a building above a hardware store, up a set of stairs that creaked under my feet. He was a small man, compact, with thin white hair combed neatly to the side, and eyeglasses he looked over rather than through when he wanted to make a point. His office smelled of old paper and furniture polish, and something faintly like pipe tobacco that no one had smoked there in years. There was a framed law school diploma on the wall from 1966, and a potted plant on the windowsill that had been dead for so long it had turned gray. He looked at the will for a very long time without saying anything. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, like gravel stirred slowly in a jar. He told me it was valid. He said those words simply and plainly, and I felt something shift under my feet. A handwritten holographic will, properly witnessed and notarized, he explained, was legally binding in this state provided it met certain conditions. He examined the notary seal. He checked the county records on the timber survey. He set the document down on the desk between us and looked at me over the top of his glasses and said that if this will had been presented at probate, the estate would not have passed the way Mr. Briggs had arranged it to pass. The property on Sutter Road, the 212 acres, the timber rights, the mineral survey, all of it, would have come directly to me. I asked him what Mr. Briggs had done with the estate instead. He told me. The property had been appraised at $400,000 and transferred to a limited liability company registered 6 weeks before my father's death. The company's single officer of record was listed under a name I didn't know, but Mr. Thorne looked at the filing and looked at me, and his expression told me everything. The company was a shell. The money had gone somewhere, and the somewhere was not anywhere I would ever have found it on my own. I asked him if that was fraud. He said the word very carefully, yes. I asked him what we could do. He said he thought quite a bit, actually, and that he'd like the chance to show me. The competing temptation was real. A settlement, quick and quiet, might get me enough for an apartment. A start, a life somewhere small. A settlement would mean signing away a claim to land my grandfather had cleared by hand and my father had bled to keep. "I'm not settling," I told him. "I want what's mine." The county seat was 3 hours by bus from where Dorothy had let me sleep on her pull-out sofa. I watched the city thin and unravel through the window. The strip malls giving way to bare fields, the fields rising into low wooded hills, the hills going dark with pine and spruce as the bus climbed. The air coming through the gap in the window changed. It lost the exhaust and the concrete smell, and picked up something clean and cold, like pine needles and damp earth just before a freeze. I had the will in my bag, wrapped in a plastic sleeve Mr. Thorne had given me. I had the photograph of my father and me in the front pocket. I had $40 in my wallet, a library card, and the name of a woman in the nearest town. A hardware store owner, George Wallace's wife, Martha, who had known my grandfather when he was still alive and working the land. Martha was a broad-shouldered woman in her 60s, with a gray braid down her back and a diner apron that had seen serious use. She looked at me for a long time when I came through the door, and then she put down the coffee pot and said, "You've got Thomas Vance's eyes and your father's chin." She said it like she was confirming something she already knew. She poured me a cup of coffee without asking and set a piece of pie down in front of me without explaining, and then said, "Son, you look like you've been through a war and lost twice. Tell me what happened." I told her. She listened the way people used to listen, without looking at the door, without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she folded her hands on the counter and said that she had wondered, when the property transferred and the new signs went up on the Sutter Road fence, whether anyone was going to do anything about it. She said my grandfather had not been a man to let things go, and she suspected his granddaughter wasn't either. She said George could get me a cot in the back of the store if I needed it while things sorted themselves out, and that she'd send word to a few people who still remembered the Vance family and might want to know what was happening. I drank the coffee. I ate the pie. The pie was apple with a thick crust, and it was the best thing I had eaten in 3 days. The property on Sutter Road was worse than I had imagined. The fence had new wire on it, tight and shining, and posted with bright orange signs. No trespassing. Summit Creek Estates Development. Behind the fence, the land rolled away in familiar shapes. The line of cottonwoods along the creek. The dark ridge of the timber on the eastern hill. The flat-bottom meadow where my father used to let me run when I was small. There was survey tape on stakes in the meadow. Orange flags every 30 feet, the kind that precede a bulldozer. I stood at the fence in the cold and looked at those flags for a long time. The wind came down off the ridge and smelled of wood smoke and pine and frozen ground. My father had died on a Tuesday in October, and it was now January, and the land was still there, and I was still there, and Summit Creek Estates had not yet broken ground. I went back to Mr. Thorne's notes. He had told me to look at something specific. The 1961 mineral survey, the one referenced in my grandfather's will. I got a copy from the county records office after 3 visits and a great deal of patience. I sat with it in the library and read it slowly, and then I read it again, and then I walked very carefully out into the cold afternoon air and found a payphone and called Mr. Thorne and read him the relevant section. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. The 1961 survey had found it. My grandfather had commissioned it privately, paid for it himself, and then had it filed with the county under a code designation that was easy to overlook if you didn't know what you were looking at. Beneath the eastern meadow, at a depth of roughly 40 feet, ran a confined aquifer, a pressurized underground water source large enough to supply several thousand acres of farmland in a county that, as of the current decade, had been in a managed drought for 11 years. Water rights attached to a confirmed aquifer of that size were not worth $400,000. They were not worth $1 million. Mr. Thorne told me, choosing his words with the care of a man who does not say large numbers casually, that we were discussing a figure closer to $3 million, potentially more, depending on how the rights were structured and negotiated. He had found something else. The original deed transfer to Summit Creek Estates Shell Company had a defect, a title chain gap going back to my grandfather's original filing that had never been properly corrected. Combined with the handwritten will which predated every subsequent instrument, the transfer was not just fraudulent. It was void. Not voidable. Void, meaning it had never legally happened. Meaning the land, the timber rights, the aquifer, the 212 acres of the Sutter Road property had never legally ceased to be mine. There was a journal at the bottom of the shoebox Dorothy had given me. I had been saving it. I had known it was there, and I had not opened it because I was not ready for it. And then, one night in the cot behind George's hardware store, with the wood stove ticking in the corner and the wind going hard off the ridge, I was ready. My father's handwriting was careful and close, the letters small and even, the way someone writes when they have learned that paper is not unlimited, and words should earn their space. The first entry was dated from the year I was born. The last was from 3 weeks before he died. He had written, "Maya, I know you will find a way. You always have. You were born stubborn, and I never once regretted it. What I have tried to do is leave you something that no one can take while you aren't looking. The land is the beginning, but the water under it is what your grandfather saw. He walked that east meadow every spring for 40 years. He said the ground never froze the same way it did on the rest of the property. He knew. He had the survey done, and he never told anyone but me, and I have never told anyone but this page. The water is yours, Maya. The land is yours. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." And then, at the very bottom of the page, underlined twice in a darker ink, as if he had come back to it, "Find Thorne. He knows the rest." The meeting at Summit Creek Estates' law firm was held in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a view of the river and furniture that had been chosen to make you feel small. There were 2 lawyers at the table, and a third man in a suit the color of charcoal, who said nothing the entire time, and watched me with flat, attentive eyes. The lead lawyer, a man in his late 40s with a smile that had been practiced until it showed no effort, told me that his client had a great deal of sympathy for my situation. He said the word sympathy with the warmth of a man reading it from a card. He said his client was prepared to be generous. He put a number on the table, $600,000. He watched my face when he said it. Mr. Thorne sat beside me and wrote something on his legal pad and did not look up. The number was meant to be the end of the conversation. I thought about the orange survey flags in the meadow where my father used to let me run. I thought about the journal in my bag, the underlined line about the water, the 40 years my grandfather spent walking that east meadow in the spring and watching where the ground refused to freeze. I thought about my father closing the notebook and knowing I would read it. I said no. The lead lawyer kept his smile in place with visible effort. He said his client could go higher. "Mr. Thorne said, very quietly, that we weren't there to negotiate a sale. The lawyer's smile flickered. I put a document on the table. Mr. Thorne had drafted it over the previous 3 weeks, in consultation with a water rights attorney and a land use specialist he had brought in from the state capitol. It was not a sale agreement. It was a community water trust, a legal instrument that would place the aquifer rights under a conservancy with the county as co-trustee, providing water access to 260 local farm families at regulated rates, in perpetuity, with Summit Creek Estates permitted to draw from a separate metered allocation at commercial pricing, subject to annual review by a citizens' board. The terms of the metered allocation would generate a rights licensing fee of $180,000 annually. The trust itself would be held in the name of the Vance family going forward. Additionally, all development on the Sutter Road property was prohibited within a 200-foot easement of the aquifer's mapped footprint. The shell company transfer was being referred to the State Bar Association and the County District Attorney's Office simultaneously with this meeting. The lead lawyer read through the document. He read it again. The man in the charcoal suit leaned over and read a section near the end. No one said anything for a long time. Then, the lead lawyer asked if we could have a moment. Mr. Thorne and I went to stand by the window and looked out at the river. He said, in a low voice and without looking at me, that he thought they were going to take it. "They always do," he said, "when the alternative is a criminal referral, and a title they can't sell, and a jury trial in a county where everybody knows the Vance name." He was right. They signed 3 weeks later. On the afternoon the contract was recorded at the county courthouse. I drove out to Sutter Road in a truck George had lent me, and I pulled up in front of the gate. The orange "No Trespassing" signs were gone. The survey flags in the meadow had been pulled. I had a key to the new padlock, and I used it, and drove down the gravel track between the cottonwoods to the house. It had been empty for 3 months, and it smelled of cold and disuse, and the particular silence of rooms no one has been living in, but the structure was sound. My grandfather had built it that way. My father had maintained it that way. I walked through every room. In the kitchen I turned on the faucet, and after a moment of coughing and rust, clear cold water ran over my hand. In the back bedroom closet, on a high shelf, I found a mason jar with a faded paper label in my grandfather's handwriting. It said, "Good water." I opened it and poured it over my fingers and stood there in the cold room with the smell of old pine floors and the faint trace of wood smoke still in the plaster walls. And I cried. I laughed first, a strange choked sound that went up into the rafters and came back to me, and then I cried. And when I was finished, I went back out to the truck and got the duffel bag, the one I had packed in 20 minutes, while Mr. Briggs stood in the doorway watching me. I carried it inside. I put the faded photograph of my father and me, the one from the front pocket, the one taken right here in the front yard, him with his hand on my shoulder and the sun in his eyes, on the kitchen windowsill where it could see the cottonwoods. The trust was funded by the following spring. 260 farm families in the county now have water access at rates that haven't changed in 3 years. The annual licensing fee is audited publicly. Mr. Briggs was disbarred. The matter of the fraudulent transfer is still working its way through the courts, as these things do. I don't need it to be resolved to know what was mine. I stand on the porch of this house sometimes in the evenings, when the light comes off the ridge long and gold, and the cottonwoods along the creek make that particular dry sound they make in a light wind, like a whispered conversation in another room. I think about my grandfather walking the East Meadow every spring for 40 years. I think about him noticing the way the ground refused to freeze. I think about him having the survey done in 1961 and filing it quietly with the county and adding that line to his will. "Do not let them take what belongs to her." Decades before I existed, decades before he could have known what shape the fight would take, or who exactly would have to fight it. He knew the water was there. He knew someone would try to take it. He left me everything I needed to stop them. And he left it in places that required me to look, to dig, to choose not to give up. That's the part no one tells you. The inheritance wasn't the land or the aquifer or the rights fees or the house. It was the decision my grandfather made to believe, in 1979, in a granddaughter who hadn't been born yet. It was my father's decision to trust that I would find the shoebox, find the will, find Mr. Thorne, find the survey. It was every step I took when I could have taken the money and walked away. The inheritance was the chance to prove them right. I think about that when I see the orange survey flags, the ones that are still in a pile in the corner of the barn where the Summit Creek people left them. I haven't thrown them away. Some mornings I need the reminder of what was almost lost. Some mornings it's useful to stand there and remember that the difference between losing everything and keeping it was a handwritten piece of paper from 1979 and a woman named Dorothy who kept it in a shoebox and waited for the right moment. If there is something that belongs to you that someone is holding on to, a truth, a right, a piece of ground, I want you to stay with it. The paperwork is real. The law is real. The records are real. What people in expensive suits are counting on is that you will not know how to use them, or that you will get tired, or that the number they put on the table will be enough. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the thing they're offering you is worth less than what you'd have to give up to take it. What is the document you haven't read yet? Tell me in the comments. Tell me about the thing that's been sitting in someone else's possession that you haven't gone looking for. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.